I found the room because I was bored and curious and had a clearance badge that opened more doors than it should have.
My name is Marco.
For 5 years, I catalogued brittle letters and forbidden petitions in the Vatican archives, the place where
The light is always too yellow, and the air always smells like old incense and mouse droppings. Most days are paperwork and whispers. Some nights are different. I started with a folding map, a margin scribble that made no sense.
I was restoring a 17th century folio when a loose sheet fell out. It was a cityscape drawn in ink so fine it
Looked like a hair on paper.
someone had annotated alleys and service tunnels, places the tourists never see.
In the lower corner was a notation in a hand I recognized from sealed files. Custodia Interna.
Below it, circled 3 times, a tiny symbol that looked like an eye inside a spiral. I had seen that symbol before, carved into the spine of a hidden ledger called Codex Tenebris.
The ledger lived behind glass in the restricted wing, and only
A handful of men even knew of its existence.
the Custodia Interna were a rumor in our corridors.
Old archivists muttered about them like they were saints or sinners.
No one put their name on a map. The map had another marking, a small black dot with the single word, Entrada. It was not on any official architectural plan. It was not on the blueprints they handed you archivists. It simply existed in the margin, a private instruction left by someone who expected another.
Pair of eyes, curiosity has a professional name in my line of work.
It is called provenance. I took the map to my bench with gloves on. I traced the lines with my fingertips until the paper warmed. I told myself I would just look, then refile, then forget.
For a week, I tried to forget.
The dot kept pulling at the back of my skull like a loose thread. On a rainy Wednesday, I followed the map. The service corridors beneath the basilica smell of damp stone and old oil.
They hum with hidden plumbing and the slow turning of ventilation.
Shafts.
I moved by memory through doors stamped with years of faithful use. No one stopped me. Maybe they thought I had a proper reason.
Maybe they were tired. Maybe the thing I was walking toward was a secret they preferred to forget. The entrance was a panel of limestone, indistinguishable from the rest until I pressed my palm to the exact point where the ink dot had sat. The stone slid as if it had been waiting for me to ask.
Behind the panel was a spiral stair so narrow my shoulders scraped the walls. A faint light, green and alien, leaked up through a crack.
At the bottom, I descended, and with every step the air tasted older. The spiral felt too perfect. The steps did not erode. They smelled of iron and something sweet and medicinal, like the kind of disinfectant used in hospitals. But older, less comforting. At the bottom I found a door that was not a door in any catalogue I had seen.
It was a slab of wood bound in bands of metal, and where the grain met the iron someone had burned the spiral eye into the core.
The metal was warm to the touch, humming with a frequency I felt rather than heard.
Above it, someone had scrawled a single line in Latin. The letters,
Rough and urgent, Cave Custodium.
"Beware the guardians." I hesitated.
I told myself to turn back, to leave the map on the bench and the secret to the shadows.
Instead, I slid the old key the map had fallen behind into the lock.
The tumblers inside it fell like teeth.
The door yielded. The corridor beyond smelled like graves and lilies. When I stepped through, something closed softly behind me.
Not a slam, but the kind of closure that happens when a place decides you belong to it.
I turned to push the door open again.
It would not move. The light went out.
The map in my pocket rustled as if reaching for air. I was inside the room that is not on any map. The first thing the room did was rearrange my breath.
The air thickened, not like fog, but like an idea turning solid.
My skin prickled.
Sound changed. Its behavior.
Footsteps echoed too long.
Candles, which should have smoked, burned clean and blue. The metal bands on the door hummed under my fingers.
I felt small and exposed, like an animal under a sky of watchful eyes. I moved forward on the same clockwork step that had carried me through centuries of duties.
The floor was not marble.
It was a mosaic of tiny tiles, each one engraved with a letter or seagull.
The spiral eye symbol was everywhere, repeated in subtle rotations until the pattern swam. Some tiles held words in a dozen dead scripts. Others showed teeth or keys or an hourglass with the sand leaking up. There was no dust. Nothing settled.
The room refused to age. At the center stood a vertical cabinet carved from dark wood and iron.
It had the look of an altar and the functionality of a filing cabinet.
Drawers, dozens of them, each with a tiny brass plate.
The plates were written in different hands.
I read titles that made my throat close. Registrum Custodium, Memori Claustra, Index of Unwanted Names.
One plate was blank. One plate had a fresh
smear of something that reflected light like wet lacquer. I reached for the nearest drawer. The handle felt warm. When I opened it, a rush of cold touched my knuckles. Inside lay documents like a miniature funeral for ink.
Rolls of parchment bundled in leather, daguerreotypes wrapped in linen.
A bundle of letters tied with human hair.
At the top was a photograph, glass cracked, but the image clear.
It showed a man standing in the same doorway I had just passed through. He wore the same expression I had when I was 19 and still believed in simple answers. Handwritten on the back, in a hand I knew because I had seen it in the margins of last ledgers, were the words, "Not found 1987. I slid the photograph back and thumbed through a folder.
A ledger fell open to a page where names clustered like a
plague map.
Dates tracked from year to year. Some entries had ink symbols beside them. Some had short notes, transferred, transcribed, contained. One line was underlined 3 times.
The name on that line matched the hand that had scrawled the notation on the door. Custodia Interna. There was evidence here, if evidence can be the word. Records, receipts, flight manifests folded into envelopes, signatures in a script that looped like fine.
A list of purchases for antiseptic and iron clamps dated 1924. A letter from a cardinal to the prefect that asked for discretion and midnight labor. I carried a stack of papers and the photograph under my arm. The air seemed to lean toward them. Curious, I began to understand the room had been made to remember what everyone else chose to forget.
It kept files on things the church catalogued, but did not discuss.
It sheltered objects too dangerous to pass into public light.
That detail alone should have driven me away.
Instead, I felt a pressure, a hunger in the room that matched the pull
of the map dot in my pocket.
I told myself I was collecting provenance, that I was doing my job, but my hands were shaking and my mouth tasted of copper. Dot in the corner, behind a column, was a small altar.
On it sat a sealed tin box.
The lid bore. The spiral eye burned through metal. When I lifted the lid, a smell rose that was both antiseptic and warm bread.
Inside was a key.
Not like the old key I had used, but new, thin, almost fragile, and stamped with numbers. 00 to 1173.
A thin strip of paper tucked beneath it read, "When you are ready, return IT." The room hummed. I realized then I had stepped into a registry of choices.
Every file was an act,
every key an instruction,
and the spiral I stitched through my skin like a needle. The door I had entered through remained unmoving.
The map in my pocket felt like a heartbeat against my thigh. I sat down on the cool mosaic. The document spread like an accusation, and waited to see which memory the room would show me next. I started with the photograph because it felt like
the smallest, least dangerous thing to touch.
The image was older than any camera I had handled. A sepia plate with corners curled. A man stood in the doorway I had used.
He wore spectacles and a suit so formal it looked ceremonial. He looked
at the lens with a tired smile.
On the back, in a hand I knew as well as my own, someone had written 3 words in Latin and 1 number. Fide custodium.
1973. The ledger I opened next was heavier. The kind of book that makes your fingers ache to turn pages.
Its leather cover had been burned and bound back together.
A brass clasp held it closed, and the lock bore the spiral eye emblem again, stamped so deep the metal had folded. Inside the pages were columns of dates, names, and terse comments. The entries were meticulous. The handwriting changed over decades, but the structure did not.
There was always a date, a name, a notation about transfer or sealing, and sometimes
a thin remark like "saw the face" or "failed to return." My own name appeared twice.
The first entry was barely legible, smudged by time, dated 1987, with a notation that read, "Subject observed, no outcome recorded." The second was chilling for its clarity.
It was recent, ink still dry enough to smear if you breathed over it. It listed my name with a date that had not yet arrived.
Next to it was a short line in a different hand. "Do not awaken. Await the bearer." I felt the room lean toward me as if it were listening.
My fingers trembled on the page.
A rumor in the archives
had whispered about the Prefect's ledger, a book kept by the Custodia Interna, accessible only when someone carried a key and the right kind of presumption.
I had both, though I had not expected either to mean anything to me. Under the ledger, in a hidden compartment, I found a stack of Xerox copies of letters.
One was from a cardinal to a prefect, dated 1969. Its language formal, but frantic.
He begged discretion and offered funds to recode a room that had begun to speak at night. Under that letter was a typed memo from 1990. It read, "Custodia Interna recommends relocation of registry."
The room resists maps. Ensure personnel rotation every 7 years. The phrase, "the room resists maps," settled in my chest like a stone. Then I found a smaller envelope, brittle with age. Inside was a photograph taken from the same angle as the first, but the man was not alone. Standing beside him was a woman I recognized from a framed portrait in the monastery refectory, a woman who had died before I began working at the archives. The caption under the image named her as Mirabel Lotti, Archivist, 1951. Her eyes in the photograph were not looking at the camera. They looked past it, as if tracking someone walking behind the photographer. Beneath the photographs was something else. A note, folded many times, with a script I could not immediately place. When I smoothed it open, I found a sequence of coordinates and a list of names. The top name had been crossed out. The second name was my own. The last line was a blunt instruction in Italian. Esi entri, prendi il numero, non parla con il custode. If you enter, take the number. Do not speak with the guardian. I set the papers down and felt suddenly exposed, as if an audience of past readers had gathered behind the shelves. The mosaic under my feet seemed to pulse in recognition. The spiral-eye tiles rotated minutely. As I shifted my weight, an optical trick that should have been impossible. Then, from somewhere beyond the cabinet and drawers, a sound that resembled footsteps began, slow and deliberate. I had not heard anyone come in. The lock on the door was still unyielding. The steps continued, approaching the room in a rhythm I could trace on the inside of my ribcage. The top drawer of the central cabinet, the one with the fresh smear of lacquer, rattled as if something tried its handle. I swallowed and reached for the thin fragile key I had found in the tin box. My hand closed around it the way a hand closes on a cord in a storm. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breath, the paper's whisper, and the clocking of a heartbeat that felt too loud. Then, faint and almost polite, came a voice from the other side of the stone, speaking a name I had never heard before. It said my name. The voice had no ordinary tone. It arrived as if a hand pressed to the back of my skull and read from a page there. Not my name exactly. A form of it folded through time, older and softer. It said the syllables and then waited. Patient as a trap. I pressed my back to the cabinet and felt the wood seam under my shoulder. The footsteps beyond the door resumed their measured pace, then halted as if the stone itself considered how to open. For a heartbeat, I imagined the Custodia Interna as men in midnight robes, bureaucrats with sealed files. Instead, the door breathed inward like an animal. When it moved, it did not swing on hinges so much as unroll its weight. The stone door slid an inch, then another, until a seam of pale light slit the room. From that seam a figure stepped, narrow and small against the light. Not tall as I expected, but oddly compact. The silhouette of someone who had folded themselves to fit into corners where secrets gather. He wore no badge I recognized. His cassock was patched with ledger paper and stitched with margins of unreadable script. Where his face should have been, there was only a smoothness, like the top of a river stone polished by time. When he inclined his head, I heard the rustle of many pages. He spoke without moving his lips. The words came soft, and they carried the flavor of old ink. You opened the door. I wanted to tell him I had not meant to intrude. I wanted to tell him the map had been misplaced, the key found, the curiosity that had meandered into this place. I wanted to ask if he knew Mirabel Lotti, or the man in the photograph, or whether my name was a misprint in the ledger. Every cautionary thing Father Matteo had said lined up behind my teeth. The note under the photograph had been clear. Do not speak with the guardian. So I kept my mouth closed. I let him look first. He moved closer, and the room registered him the way a pond registers a pebble. The tiles shifted minutely beneath his shoes, the spiral eye catching a faint glint that had not been there. He reached a hand forward and did not touch the ledger or the photograph. Instead, he bowed toward them, as if acknowledging an altar. You carry a key, he said. His voice was a single reed played in an empty hall. You do not belong to the rotation. My fingers tightened on the thin key. Heat pulled at my palm where the metal met skin. The guardian did not step any closer. His presence was a boundary and a question. Why are you here? He repeated, this time phrased like a ledger entry rather than an interrogation. I wanted to answer that I had followed a map, that I catalogued histories, that I was hungry for provenance and had been foolish. I wanted to tell him about the note tucked under the photograph that said take the number. I wanted it to be as simple as retrieving a token and walking out. But the rule spelled on the back of the old envelope rose in my memory. Do not speak with the guardian. So I nodded. A small motion, almost involuntary. It was not a word,
but it was an answer. He inclined his head as if the motion satisfied an old bureaucratic box.
Then, from his sleeve, he produced a narrow tray.
On it lay a stack of thin metal chips,
flat as coins, each stamped with a number and a tiny spiral eye. The top coin bore the next count.
I had not expected such literalness.
The room hummed as if approving a procedural action.
He extended the
tray without looking at me. I could have refused. I could have run for the door that would not open and tried until my shoulders bled. I could have left the documents and the photograph and pretended none of it had ever happened.
Yet the pull of the map, the ledger, the photograph, and that underlined line in the Prefect's book all pressed like thumbs against the same bruise.
My hand rose before my mind arranged consent.
The coin was oddly cold and heavy, as if it held a small weight of midnight.
I did not read the number before my thumb closed on it.
The guardian watched and then, with a gesture that might have been a benediction or an inventory check, slid the tray back into his sleeve.
You will carry this into the registry, he said.
You will not speak to the room. You will not call it
by any name known outside.
When the number is drawn, you will be called. He did not say called by whom. He did not say how.
He only tilted his head as if to finalize the sentence, and then the seam of light eased shut until the door was whole.
Once more, the stone did not return to its indifferent position.
It held a fraction of a breath, like a secret keeping watch.
I cradled the coin in my palm.
Its number was simple and terrible. The map in my pocket rustled, an insistence.
The photograph in my hand felt colder.
The room hummed the same note I felt at the center of my chest. Something had begun to register me as part of a ledger. Another row under a column that stretched beyond the building and into unspoken years.
Outside, the corridor remained silent. Inside, the room that is not on any map waited with the patience
of a ledger, and I could not tell whether I had been recorded or had volunteered to be noted.
The coin pressed shallow circles into my skin, and for the first time I truly felt the weight of a counted thing. The coin sat heavy in my palm like a confession. I had expected a ritual, a sermon, maybe a slow voice telling me I had made a mistake. Instead, I felt the ledger move under every surface of the room, as if pages turned themselves in a library somewhere else. The guardian had gone. The seam in the stone door had sealed without a sound. I was left alone with a numbered metal disc and a stack of documents that smelled of odd smoke. I found the registry before I found the answer.
It was a narrow drawer tucked beneath the cabinet, the one with no label.
Inside were tiny slips of paper, thin as onion skin and curled at the edges. Each slip carried a single number and a name.
Many names I recognized from the margins of official ledgers, local parish bulletins, obituaries that never printed, notes that suggested absence as policy.
Some names were familiar because I had handled them, trimmed their seals, catalogued their signatures.
Others were unknown until I read them aloud and felt the room twitch to the bottom of the stack. There was a slot with a slit like a mail chute. I understood then how the coin was meant to be used.
The guardian had not given me a token to be kept.
He had issued an invitation.
The coin's number matched a slip in the drawer. Mine.
The slip was older than the others, as if the ink wanted to fade but refused. I fed my coin into the slot and heard the metal land with a small, decisive clink. Something in the room changed.
Not the shape of it, but the mood. The tiles seemed to deepen their colors. The spiral eye motif rotated in my peripheral vision
and settled on a quadrant of the ceiling where a panel I had not noticed slid open.
A thin ribbon of light revealed a small glass window, and behind it another figure.
Not a man, not a ghost, but a face like a photograph held to the light.
It was me, or it had been me.
The image showed a younger version of my face, hair unlined, eyes curious.
Ink beneath it read a date that had not yet come. I turned the pages of the ledger until my finger found a line annotated in a hurried, different hand. It said that once a coin was entered the room, would select a registry.
The selection could be drawn immediately or deferred, an administrative term that felt cruel next to the reality. There were notes in the margins about appeals, about clerics who had tried to petition a different fate, about a woman who had sewn a countermark inside her glove and vanished anyway.
The word that kept returning in the margins was nomination.
The room did not take at random.
It preferred names that were called. A soft mechanism clicked, and the narrow drawer that had held the slips slid back into the cabinet.
The panel above me exhaled light, and then offered a new slit. From within the wall a thin tube extended, and a single folded paper nudged out like a tongue. I unfolded it. At the top was a list of names.
At the bottom, under a header in cramped script, was a line that read, "Next drawer." Now, my throat went dry.
All at once I heard the distant echo of bells, a hollowing sound that might have been a hammering on a bell tower, or might have been a drum beating inside the masonry.
The window revealed a second photograph, this one of a woman I recognized, her expression withdrawn and terrified.
The caption read, Return 1995. I felt the ledger's patience like pressure on my shoulder. I had choices. If choices is what you call gestures that are already accounted for, I could attempt to leave, pound the stone until my hands blistered,
Call for help and hope someone believed the geometry of the building over what I had seen.
or I could wait for the drawer and watch the room call its next name. I thought of the men and women whose images I had seen in the files. I thought of Marat,
Bellotti, and the note that had warned me not to speak with the Guardian. The room hummed a single note, patient and inevitable.
My coin lay in its slot, metal warmed by the registry beneath.
I sat on the mosaic until my knees ached, trying to steady a breath that sounded too loud.
The paper trembled in my hands.
The moment to know had arrived. The paper trembled in my fingers as if it had a pulse.
I could hear my own breath in the hush of the room, loud and clumsy, like a drum in a cathedral.
The slit in the wall exhaled a thin ribbon of air. The photograph in the window stared back at me, younger, softer, as if the ledger remembered me without mercy. I tried to stand, and the tiles caught my weight the wrong way. The spiral I pattern swam, aligning itself into a single large circle. Over the central cabinet,
Light poured at its center, not harsh but precise, like a spotlight on an accusation. The room did not ask for noise.
it asked for attendance. From behind the cabinet, a metal box folded open. Inside, mechanically, a small wheel turned and a tiny hand of brass swept over numbered slots.
It sounded almost cheerful, a clatter-like.
A toy.
The brass hand paused. A bell chimed, not with sound, but with a sensation that rustled down my spine.
A single slip of paper ejected from the mechanism, sliding across the desk and coming to rest at my fingertips. My hands moved slow enough that I could watch the motion like a separate person.
I unfolded the slip.
There was a name. The ink was precise, the same red that stained the Prefect's ledger. I did not expect to know it. I did not expect to feel the list like weather over my skin. The name printed there was one I had read in the margins of parish reports. It was the name of a registrar who had once argued with a cardinal about what should be archived and what should be locked away. When the name registered, the room shifted.
Not dramatically, only an adjustment, the way an animal aligns itself to a scent. Somewhere within the walls a drawer clicked closed, sealing a file. The photograph in the window blinked, as if someone behind it had touched their eyes. I felt the coin in my pocket grow warmer.
The spiral I at my chest hummed like a small, steady instrument. There was no trumpet,
No thunder.
no sign to warn the world outside. The drawer was intimate and bureaucratic and final.
The room had pulled one life into its rotation and returned.
The ledger to its calm of dust and oil.
I understood then that the registry was less a trap and more a contract that wrote itself as events unfolded. People were not taken by violence. They were taken by ink and procedure. I could have left then.
The slot had closed.
The brass hand had retreated. The light dimmed.
The Guardian did not return. The stone door sat quiet. I sat very still and listened.
For sounds of the city, for a phone, for voices, for anything that would prove the mundane world still existed.
There was only the slow, metronomic turning of some internal gear on the paper. Beneath the printed name, someone had added a line. In a different hand. It was cramped, urgent, and written in a script I recognized from marginalia in many forbidden books. The line read, "Sign the form.
Accept the burden." My throat tightened. I imagined forms and seals, the dignity of bureaucracy mixed with the violence of fate. There was a pen at the edge of the desk, heavy, stubbed with black lacquer.
It sat as if waiting for me to take responsibility, not only for what the room did, but for what my presence meant. I could think of reasons to refuse.
I could imagine coughing and spilling the ink, throwing the coin back through the slot, smashing the mechanism.
I tried to picture myself running, forcing the stone door until it gave, shouting until someone opened the heavy gates of the basilica, and found me screaming like a madman. Every escape I envisioned folded back into the same fact. The room recorded. It responded to a transaction. My finger closed around the pen. The metal felt familiar, like a relic I had catalogued years before. I drew the weight of the nib across the paper, and signed with the small, careful script I had been taught as a child. The sound of the pen on the ledger was louder than any shout when I finished. The page sank into the tree and the brass wheel turned once more. The photograph in the window slid shut. The light in the spiral I dimmed to a thin, satisfied glow. I had not been dragged to a pit. I had not been snatched in shadow.
I had been recorded and acknowledged and entered. Outside the room, the world felt marginally different.
Perhaps it was my ears that had changed.
Perhaps a ledger had simply given me a number and a place.
The key in my pocket was heavy and warm.
The coin had not changed. I sat back on the mosaic, palms on the cool tiles, and listened for the first time to the ledger's silence.
It was not empty. It was full of pages turning somewhere I could not see. I pushed the stone door the first
time, and it did not move. I expected a wedge of resistance, a mechanical refusal, or at least the bureaucratic indignity of a locked gate.
Instead, the surface yielded like someone sliding open a curtain. I stepped into the corridor I had descended hours earlier and blinked. The air tasted different. The lamps that had been a faint yellow now burned a cool blue. Marble veins looked older.
The corridor curved at a place it had not curved before.
A map would have called it an error, but the room had an appetite for correcting maps. Let's see the central archive desk. A junior archivist looked up as if he knew me.
He did not ask why I had been gone. He handed me a stack of invoices and a printed
memo from the prefect.
I read the memo and felt a thin ice run down my spine. The date on it was today, but the signature belonged to a man I remembered retiring 5 years ago.
The language was formal, the kind of phraseology that meant the writer had not been interrupted in a long time.
The memo instructed all staff to account for the registry rotation today and to submit names to the Custodia Interna for review.
The note was stamped with the spiral eye in crimson wax. I asked about Marat Lotte. The junior archivist blinked, confused.
Marat had never been assigned to that wing. He had only heard the name in a reprimand given decades earlier when a young assistant was found cataloguing mislabeled sepulchres. He could not find any record of the woman in the active personnel files. When I produced the photograph from the room, his face tightened as if recognizing a ghost from a dream. He told me quietly that some documents had recently been reclassified and relocated. He did not elaborate. Walking the city felt off. Streets I thought I knew twisted into alleys that did not exist on Google Maps.
A CAF I frequented was now a bookbinder's shop. The obelisk in the piazza leaned slightly, as if someone had moved the ground a finger's breadth.
People passed me without looking twice.
I tried to make sense of it.
Perhaps my memory was
frayed.
Perhaps the room had not let me go at all, and I was walking inside a memory it chose to feed me.
The spiral eye on my coin warmed through my pocket, and I felt the ledger's presence like a slow tide. Back at the room I did what I feared. I opened more drawers.
Behind a false back panel I found a cassette tape sealed inside a packet of wax cloth.
The label was handwritten. Return Testimony 1995. I had only handled Xeroxes and brittle drafts until that moment. I had not expected a voice to speak to me in my hands. I found a player, ancient and patient, and fed the tape into it. The voice was a man's, thin and winded, recorded in a way that seemed to walk the air around the words. He identified himself as Pietro, a clerk. He spoke of the registry like one speaks of a farm. Rotations, harvests, seasons. He said that he had been drawn in and then returned 3 years later. He sounded relieved at first, but relief in the recording was a layer like varnish.
Underneath, he described waking up in a town he knew, but not knowing the names of his neighbors. He said his wife did not remember him at first. Children he had known had different faces. He told the listener that the room reweaves small things.
Time slips. Names erode like water on the stone.
He said if the ledger reclaims you, you will not be taken by violence. But that was not mercy. Pietro's voice changed.
He coughed.
He said the worst part was the loss of continuity. Not the absence of life, but the absence of being recognized by the life you had built.
He stopped the tape to clear his throat and then, almost in apology, he added a detail that cold burned my blood.
He said the spiral eye did not mark only the ledger. It marked bloodlines.
It favored certain hands and certain faces.
The room liked histories. It liked lines that could be counted. He finished by whispering, "Do not give them genealogy.
Do not volunteer anyone else."
The tape clicked it.
The player's wheels continued to turn as if they needed a moment to be convinced.
I sat in the dim room with that whisper bobbing inside my head. Every photograph seemed a window and every ledger an instrument of forgetting. I had signed. I had taken a number. The city remembered me differently now.
Pietro's confession folded over my shoulder like another document.
The spiral eye on my coin thrummed, patient and exact. I understood then that leaving was not a single act. It was a negotiation, and the ledger had already added my name to the margins of a story I had not agreed to finish After Pietro's tape, I understood the ledger's cruelty more clearly.
It did not drag people into oblivion with violence.
It rewired their stories until the world around them blinked and forgot.
That was the room's real theft. It stole recognition. The small daily facts that make alive.
I thought then about Mirabolotti and the registrar whose name had just been drawn.
I thought about the faces on the photographs and the way the spiral I warmed in my palm like a heartbeat. I went back to the corridor because leaving felt like a coward's trick. If the registry rewrote continuity, perhaps the same bureaucracy
that had catalogued disappearances also had rules that could be used.
I wanted the ledger to see me as more than a file.
I wanted to bargain.
I wanted to reroute the rotation, or at least mark names with warnings. Prideful and foolish motives. The Guardian had warned me against speech. The Prefect's ledger had asked for signatures. Paper was their language.
I hoped words could still change the ink. The door yielded to my palm as if it expected me.
Inside, the room smelled of dust and antiseptic, as it always did now. The Guardian was not there.
The central cabinet hummed with patient machinery.
The spiral I spun a little wider when it saw me. The registry drawer said ready. The coin slot opened like an eye.
The photograph window showed a new face.
Not my face. Not yet. The brass wheel was idle. It felt as if I had arrived between beats in the ledger's margin.
I pulled up the ledger and read farther than I had before. There were appendices, codes for exceptions, notes on appeals. A name I had seen in a blacked-out column appeared as an acronym. Footnotes referenced negotiations that took place in the 17th century.
Somewhere across generations, clerics had argued for mercy and lost. The ledger recorded their dissent as marginalia.
It was a bureaucratic history of human stubbornness. That's when I saw it. An insertion clause that had never appeared in the Prefect's ledger Xeroxes I had copied earlier. It required a bearer to accept 2 acts.
1. To remain bound to the registry until a proper successor volunteered or was appointed.
2. To administer an amendment when the room called a name that could be traced to living descendants.
In plain Italian it read, Custodia Interna e Sacrificio.
Custody is care and sacrifice. A bargain, dressed in administrative terms.
The ledger offered a way to alter the outcome.
It made me an offer any archivist would find perversely reasonable. Take on the registry as a living instrument.
Protect lines when possible. Rotate names into sanctuaries rather than erasure. In exchange, the bearer would be bound, not killed, not devoured,
but wholly claimed by the room's work. One body to answer for many. I sat until the ink blurred. The coin clinked in its pocket like a small pulse. I thought of running and of the edges of the city that had already shifted. I thought of Pietro's voice and the way his wife did not know him when he returned.
If I stepped away now, I risked consigning more people to that white noise of forgetting. If I stayed, I would become a node, a bureaucratic hand that could try to tilt the ledger toward mercy.so assigned again. This time my signature was ceremonial and final.
I used my full name and the keys Father Matteo had given me for protection.
The brass wheel turned as I wrote. The photograph in the window changed and displayed a group of faces, some familiar, some new. The Guardian materialized without sound, bowed, and slid a thin ribbon across the desk. It was a list of contacts, names of priests and scholars who might be persuaded to help reclassify certain files, people who could create legal continuity when the room tried to sever it.
The room accepted me the way a ledger accepts a new entry.
It did not ask whether I wanted to be trapped. It simply required that I understand the terms.
I understood. I also understood the price.
Once bound, my absence from the outside world would grow subtle and then absolute. Friends would look at me like a man they vaguely remembered.
Records would misfile me. The city would fold me into a different current of memory.
The spiral eye on the coin warmed and then cooled as if testing my resolve. Before I left the archive, the Guardian touched the photograph in the window. The image shifted to a view of the basilica above, a corridor I had walked 1,000 times but never seen. The Guardian's voice, at last human, said one sentence I had been too proud to hear before. They do not take without reason.
They take so someone can hold the ledger. I walked back through the door that was not on any map and found the corridor different again.
Lamps burned with the old light. Junior archivists passed me with faces that did not fully keep me. Outside, the city had rearranged in small, insidious ways.
My phone no longer reached one contact.
An email account I used was closed and archived. Pietro's face and voice stayed in my memory like a small, bright hole. I am in the room now most nights. I sign entries and try to reroute names where I can. I cannot leave fully. That is my confession and my duty. I keep copies of documents hidden in places only I can access. I send them sometimes in envelopes that arrive with no return address.
The outside reads them and then forgets to register the sender.
If you are listening to this story, know two things. First, the room exists and it is patient.
Second, if you find a map with a dot in its margin, do not press your palm to the stone. Curiosity leads to numbers.
Numbers led to choices.
Some choices bind you in ways no ledger can fully explain. At night, I still hear the faint turning of pages.
The sound is not cruel.
It is simply the sound of records being kept. It comforts and terrifies me.
I cannot leave. I do not know if I can ever be found again by the world I grew up in.
I did not become a prisoner in the way the old tales tell. I became the ledger's hand. I became, in a narrow and strange way, its hope.